in order to get the things correct and stay in a healthy manner going forward, I think all these other people will have to come into play.
We'll be joining that interview in just a moment. From Asia News Weekly, this is Asia Now, the podcast featuring stories and interviews from the Asia Pacific region. While they seem to come and go every year, the slash and burn operations in Sumatra and Kalimantan, Indonesia, have spread their haze far and wide, impacting many nations. But how did we get here? That's today's conversation taking place in Asia now. Hello everybody, Steve Miller here with you today, and I'd like to thank you so much for downloading and listening to this week's Asia Now podcast. This year, the fires in Sumatra and Kalimantan have plagued the region. There really isn't a better way to go about and describe it. The slash and burn operations have generated a thick smoke that have blown way past the borders of Indonesia and are severely impacting Malaysia, Singapore, and a host of other nations. If you go on Twitter and happen to follow the Twitter feeds of news organizations, you'll see pictures from their reporters of the dense haze enveloping the area. In fact, things are so bad that some in Indonesia have said that without concerted effort, it could take up to 3 years to successfully bring about a resolution to this ecological catastrophe. But the fires aren't anything new. They've taken place on a near annual basis for years. So, what has happened in 2015 to bring us to this point? That's the question I put to Sanjay Swarup, Associate Professor at the National University of Singapore.
Yeah, I mean, this is not the first time we have had these episodes of haze. To some extent, more or less, they have been occurring every year, right? 2002, we saw a big one. To 2013, again, there was quite a big one. But this year, we have, from what we can see from a scientific perspective, is that being a very super dry year, technically being an El Nino year, which NOAA, this National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, this office and the group in the U.S., they have mentioned 85% El Nino year for this period. So that's why, because of this extra dry period, we saw that it was more predisposed to fire for peatlands this year than any year before. And this might not be the last dry year in the weather. There might be other drier years to come. So we just have to watch out for such dry years. But basically, it's due to this dryness, I believe.
Now, there was one report that surfaced that Indonesia basically said it could take up to 3 years to contain and put out the fires. Is that a realistic expectation? Are things that bad it could take so long?
Okay, so when you say the word contained, we have to go to the root of the matter to really contain it on a more long-term basis, right? And for that, we know that there are already things in place in Indonesia, in the right places, in the right provinces where these fires have been originating. But going forward, those legal frameworks might have to be strengthened with some of these other kinds of things, because the fires, once they've happened, we understand that it's more complex than just the act of starting the fires or things catching fire naturally by themselves in dry years. For example, technology can help predict when certain years might be more predisposed, such as what happened this year. These are available, these predictions and these kinds of way of watching more carefully in certain years. It could be predicted on a scientific basis, right? And therefore, it could be combined with vigilance, a more closer look at certain things that can be prevented, putting certain preventive measures more intensively in such years, and these have to also come with better education at the ground level, so people at the ground understand that what are the various implications. when the fires start. So getting all these things in place might, take a few years to put in place. But certainly, some elements of these holistic measures could start earlier. And uh, I sincerely believe it will take somewhere, yeah, close to 3 to 5 years with multiple stakeholders coming in to come out with things to contain this for future.
Well, speaking of multiple stakeholders, there has been a lot of criticism directed towards Indonesia for the way that they've handled things, the way they've responded to things. Is that kind of criticism justified? Because we're also looking at multinational companies coming in there and starting these fires. Is it more of a logistics and legal framework within Indonesia, or are there more things at play?
Yeah, I mean, pointing the fingers to Indonesia in general, that's the easiest and the fastest thing to do is to find, people who can take the blame. But that's the easy way out, right? To point towards an administration. But is really governance the main issue when we start these and see these fires, when we see them happening? As I mentioned earlier, right, there are many ground level issues. There are, in fact, livelihood issues. So imagine the people at the ground. Um, there are livelihoods of many people in these. These are large areas that were affected this year. And not only that, the health effects. We have all seen and heard about the kind of particles and the chemicals to which the people at the ground zero they were all exposed. So, in order to get the things correct and stay in a healthy manner going forward, I think all these other people will have to come into play. And I believe because these kind of ecosystems, they are very unique to this part of the world, and it's a heritage for Southeast Asia. So perhaps people working towards conserving these peatlands and working with the local groups would also have to chip in. So I think at different levels, people will have to come in, and we can't just put blame on individual countries or governments. I think it has to be taken collectively. Companies have been identified, they have been taken to task. But is this really going to stop the fires? Perhaps it's only part of the solution, right?
Right.
So there have to be other people who will need to come in and not necessarily take the blame, but we have to see what can be done to correct it. What are the ways to go forward? I think past is only for us to learn, right?
Environmentally, what are we looking at in terms of implications for the region in the short term?
So we are all quite aware on the impacts on air, on the health. These are the most obvious ones, so I won't talk about them. But the less obvious ones I'd like to just highlight environmentally are the ones that will affect the weather, the local weather, right? So imagine all the carbon dioxide, all the chemicals, and the activated carbon particles that have come as part of this fire and haze. They are going to be trapped in the moisture and the clouds, which are very prevalent this time of the year in the tropics. And as carbon dioxide is soluble in water, many of these particles will all get affected by the moisture of the clouds. So the clouds will get acidified because of CO2 getting mixed with moisture, and air particles get trapped into clouds. So when the cloud behaviors will change, so will the local weather in the short term, right? And what's important is we should think the next step forward. After cloud changes, they will be making rain in different places at different periods of time, and they will be traveling at different heights. Therefore, the rain, which is affecting food production, is what I would like to highlight for people to realize will be the one of the sectors that might take a blow because of this changing weather as an outcome of such events.
When you think about that, I almost want you to take a moment and even look further down the line. I mean, if that's what we could look at in terms of short term, what about longer term ecological impacts?
Yeah, so I mean, weather, as we know, in the next 3 to 5 years, and this is nothing new. You can almost plot that how weather has been changing since the time these land use change started in Southeast Asia, and we can see that weather patterns and meteorological parameters have been changing. But as if you take it forward, the long term will be on the regional climate, right? So the whole region of Southeast Asia and South Asia, which is very near to this place where land use change is happening in the nearby forested regions, there is going to be a long-term impact on regional climate. What that means is, again, coming back to the rain patterns, coming back to food security. So food security in the long run is also going to be affected. We have to realize that more than half of food production and rice production and so on in the rice bowls of this part of the world are all rain fed. They depend on rain. And so when weather and in the long run the climate changes, this is going to be hit in some multiple ways. So we have to watch out for them. The second part in the long run, what I see is the plantations also, the commercial plantations, while we are painting them in the negative way, but plantations also, because of the way peatlands are now changing their texture, they're getting oxidized. Peat is being lost physically to the air as CO2, right? And when fires happen, a lot of peat is actually lost. And for the ones that have been already converted to plantations, in addition to the fire affected regions, the plantations are also losing out, because as the peat is being lost, the plantation trees are going to topple, and they are already toppling in many plantations that we visit in these regions. And so it's a sustainability issue for plantations also. How do we slow down? And therefore, scientists, technologists, educators, and we have to work with policy people to ensure that some sustainable practices come into play. We have to bring these other alternative methods to help the sustainability of plantations.
Well, speaking of best practices moving forward, I mean, as you mentioned, the weather patterns are somewhat predictable, at least in a short term, 3 to 5 years. What are some of these practices that should be employed so we don't arrive at a situation like this 4 or 5 years down the road, where we have haze that starts over in Indonesia and expands trans-border not only within Southeast Asia or in that little hub, but as far as the Philippines?
Yeah, yeah. No, certainly that has this year was bad, but the things that we can think of course, it will have to come as a combination of ground level efforts for working with the people whose livelihood depends on these pieces of land, uh, to ensure that, as I mentioned earlier, to be vigilant that the kind of bad practices that have been happening, especially in the dry years, in those years, to put in better practices in hand. Secondly, to have some technological support where these people can have better livelihoods from intact pieces of land rather than burnt pieces of land in the long term as well. So, what that means is, can we make better use of peat economically? Can we can we conserve the peat forest and get some forest services out, which will help economic development in that region? And there are good examples all over the world of forest services supporting the regional economy. So some of those best practices have to come in. We are, of course, working from Southeast Asia to develop such sustainable practices, which can be scaled down and should be not very high technologies, but technologies that can be employed at these levels in these parts of the world, so that people get disincentivized and companies get incentivized from the legal frameworks. So, as a combination of multiple approaches, we can collectively come up with such practices, right?
One last question before I let you go, and I'll kind of leave the floor open to you. What else do you think we should know about what's going on?
Uh, some things that have been discussed recently is that, yes, there will be plans to bring up water levels. If you keep the peat wet, then it will not come up with fire. Um, But the science, if we look into what's happening in peatlands, is that some of these peatlands, most of them, they are already in the low-lying regions, right? That's how peat develops. And in Southeast Asia, if the rains are so high and torrential, being in the tropics, we expect the water table to keep going up and down because it's not feasible in a short period of time to dam up all of the peatlands because they run in millions of hectares.
Mm-hmm.
So peat levels will go up and down. There will be a process what we call re-wetting, and because of that, large amounts of CO2 is expected to actually come out, which has already been coming out. And if we are changing the levels of CO2, then we have to find out what will be the greenhouse emission effects on the weather connection and therefore food security going forward. So any measures that we take hydrological have to be combined with some other measures, for example, using the good microbes that can keep the peats from being oxidized and lost, keeping the emissions low. When peat does not oxidize, does not get lost, plantations will also have sustainable production for many years. So technology can, together working with policy and therefore education as well at the ground level, that's what I would like to say we should think together in these directions. Yeah.
Excellent. Dr. Swarup, thank you so much for your time this week.
You're most welcome, Steve.
Again, I'd like to thank Dr. Swarup for his time this week, but before I go, I'd love to hear from you. Have you been affected by the haze this or any other year? Please send in your comments or simply record your message on your phone, on your computer, and email it in. Asia Now is a special feature of the Asian News Weekly podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, please share it with your friends, and if you haven't, subscribe. Subscribing is absolutely free, and when you do, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. You can subscribe on our website, asiannewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application. You can also keep up with more news from the region by following Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please drop us a line. The email address is podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, remember to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.